Our speaker today is Tom Baker. Tom is a popular speaker. I read it right. Popular speaker, a professional counselor, longtime student of the Casey Readings, teacher of A Course in Miracles, and former Catholic priest. Now, former Catholic priest is interesting because he's now a minister of the Fellowship of the Inner Light. So his possibly unique career path has taken him from the biggest church in the world to the smallest. Now, obviously, he opted for quality over quantity. So please welcome our friend, our brother, our teacher, Tom Baker.
Thank you, Lloyd. That was very sweet, wasn't it? And funny. Nothing like funny, huh? Well, I'm going to start out. When I was in the Catholic Church, I was a priest for 10 years, and I was a Catholic for about 17 years. I'm no longer a Catholic. I'm just a spiritual man who's curious. So, anyway, when I was in the Catholic Church, when I thought of Jesus, I thought of a dead man. I thought of a man who was sad, who was tortured to death, and who was expired. That from somehow our sins were forgiven by Jesus dying. I never got that, even as a priest. It's embarrassing to say. But when it came to why Jesus died for our sins, I could never answer it. But I could say Jesus rose for our life. That made much more sense to me. That was real. And Jesus is anything but a dead man. He's life in all its nuances and in all its variable definitions. Everywhere Jesus went, people were healed and they came alive. In the middle of a storm on the Sea of Galilee, Jesus, the mystic, calmed the storm and saved the ship on which he was sleeping. Jesus was sleeping during a storm. You talk about peaceful. And there were no sleeping pills in those days, so he was really relaxed. Jesus was also a vital and concerned friend, as close as a brother to everyone he met. We know this gentle soul. We all know Jesus, who is gently waking us up from a dream in which we are trapped. Now, I'm going to talk about Jesus the healer first. I think of the amazement of seeing someone get well in just a few minutes right in front of you. That must have been an amazing moment, especially with the lepers. You know, these were outcast people. They were people that no one would talk to. And if you got near them, they would say, get back. Everywhere they went, they were alone. And imagine that moment when Jesus cleansed that leper, when all of that disfigurement went away. And they could go back to their villages and hug their families and hug their friends and greet everybody again to say, hey, I'm all right. I'm just like you and you're just like me. That was a moment. You could tell why people were fascinated with this man, because he sent people back who were broken, he sent them back whole. Now, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but when I have been sick, really sick, and I've been really sick several times in my life, I would cry out, I'm sorry. Have anybody ever had that when they were really sick? Yeah, I'm one of the few, I guess. I'm one of the only. Now, this cry of I'm sorry came from a place in my mind that was primitive, that was very, very basic. And it was a call out, I realize now, to the Old Testament God who punished you if you were bad. As a priest, I would often go in to visit people in the hospital. You know what they said to me most often? Help, that's one thing they'd say. They would say, why is God doing this to me? What did I do that made God turn on me? I'm really sorry. And they would go to confession and they would talk about all their bad things that they did and how sorry they were, and they begged God to let them get well. Now, that's not a God that I can believe in. This was the God that smited people. A lot like Donald Trump. He was a Donald Trump God. Sorry to get political, I'll stop there. Change that. All right, he was like anybody who's scared to death about himself and who takes it out on everybody else. That doesn't work? Okay. Well, leave me there, okay? Don't turn me off yet. But when Jesus healed, he often forgave sins, as if to say, what was making you sick or making you vulnerable to sickness no longer existed. And people got it. They got it in a few minutes. For Jesus' version of God was a gentle, healing God of compassion and grace. Yet in Christianity, we keep resurrecting the condemning, judging God of ancient times. And I hesitate to say the Old Testament because this is a God that goes way, way back to the God that wanted child sacrifices. This is a God that we have in mind. It's a sneaky little God, sometimes called the ego, sometimes called the devil. Yeah, it's this God who says, we will correct you by punishing you. You know, we have correctional institutions, which are punishment institutions. They're not correctional institutions. No correction in prison. But anyway, this is the kind of God that my parishioners believed in. And as a priest, I often encountered people who were terrified. Not terrified of life, terrified of God. One day at Christmas, when we were hearing the children's confessions, a little girl came into confession. She was 7 years old, and she was trembling. And she said, Father, I'm very, very bad. And I said, sweetheart, what's wrong? She said, I'm trying to kill my mother. She said, well, that does sound serious. What makes you think you're trying to kill your mother? And she said, well, every time I act up, my mother says I'm killing her. Isn't that sad? I said, no, your mother, that's just an expression. Your mother says, you're killing me. She just says that because she's impatient or she's at the end of her rope or all that kind of thing. You know, even as I tried to explain it, I got into deep trouble. She's at the end of her rope. She's going to hang, you know, that kind of thing. Oh. And she said to me, or she asked me, she said, Father, am I a murderer? Am I going to go to hell? And I assured her she wasn't going to go to hell, that God was like a wonderful grandfather, that he would never send his children to hell. And Jesus was her best friend, and she must realize that hell was a frightening thing that people talked about but wasn't true. At that moment, I felt like Jesus letting someone know of their angelic innocence. even in the face of a severe misunderstanding. It was really a great moment after a while. Now, we all walk around with a severe misunderstanding, thinking that something is wrong with us. Something wrong physically or emotionally or spiritually. My body has betrayed me. Here I am, 74, and I can say my body has betrayed me. Something is wrong with me. Well, what if there was nothing wrong with us? What if we were never guilty? What if God never condemned us? What if this is a made-up story? What if we just got the notion, when we were away from God, it seemed, that God was mad at us? We've made up that story by people who don't talk to us. You know, sometimes you pass somebody and they don't talk, and they say, oh, they're mad at me. It's a story we very easily believe. I have come to believe, that's why I'm not a priest anymore, I have come to believe that God never condemned us. He was never mad at us. He never spewed wrath upon people. He never killed people. That was all people's imagination. And it's a sad imagination. Yet with one touch, Jesus takes the proof of unworthiness away. That's what he did when he healed. He took away the proof of unworthiness. Wherever he went, crutches were piled in a corner. Former lepers hugged their families, and the sticks the blind used to feel their way along had disappeared. That's what being with Jesus was like. You were always tripping over a crutch. Jesus the mystic. Now, a mystic, you probably think, what is a mystic? Mystic is always in prayer, has a kind of angelic look on their face all the time, is never mean to anybody, etc., etc. I wouldn't say that. I think a mystic is someone who recognizes the innocence in everybody they meet and knows the innocence in themselves. Every mystic sees the best in everybody and cultivates the goodness and strength of God in everyone they meet. Isn't that nice? That's what a mystic does. Now, in seeing God everywhere and in everyone, their vision is that of love for all and connection with even the most despicable or misunderstood human beings. They see something in everybody that's the spark of love and innocence. A wonderful mystic of modern times was none other than Fred Rogers. Mr. Rogers. You remember Mr. Rogers? Yeah. I knew a man who had taught Fred Rogers in the seminary. He was a minister. And he had taught him homiletics. He was my homiletics teacher, and he taught Mr. Rogers homiletics, or sermon giving. He said that Mr. Rogers was the same in person as he was on TV. This was the real deal. This was not an act. He could see the good and the innocent in everybody. He planted a seed of Christ consciousness in both children and adults when he said he liked you just the way you are. Can you imagine a child hearing that for the first time? I like you just the way you are. It's not that I like you when you clean up your room, or I like you when you do your homework, or I like you when you do your chores. I like you just the way you are. Even if you're lazy, even if you're a drug addict, I still like you and I love you. That has nothing to do with my loving or liking you, the way you are. And when he met you, Fred Rogers, it was like he had known you for a long time and wanted to know you better. Fred just made your soul twinkle. Ha! A year before I was ordained a priest, I spent 3 months in a Trappist monastery in Georgia where I did not talk. This was very hard for me, because I love to talk. During that 3 months, things became very clear and very simple. I could read people perfectly. If you were depressed, if you were sad, if you were angry, it's like the facade was transparent. I could see through what you were doing. I wasn't buying what you were selling, in other words. I could see the real person. I could see everybody for what they were. And you know, it was all good. People always had good intentions. The intentions often fall away to greed and to selfishness and that kind of thing. But people really have a good intention down deep. Most people do. My spiritual director at the monastery was a priest named Damien Torque. Isn't that a great name for a monk? Damien Torque. He was a great big guy who was the heavy equipment operator at the monastery. He drove backhoes and tractors. And he was a big square man with a white shock of hair. And he was a mystic. He was always happy, but for no reason. What Eckhart Tolle called uncaused joy. One bright Sunday in July, we had a perfect summer day. And I went to Father Damien and I asked him if he would want to take a walk with me. He smiled at me and said, "Not today, it's too beautiful." Isn't that, have anybody ever answered you like that? It's not today because it's so beautiful. If I went out today, it would be too much. Beautiful days make me ecstatic. I would be too happy to talk, and I would dance around and act silly. Even on a regular day, I have to suppress my joy. Isn't that something? And then he said something that I've never forgotten. He said, "I am a reverse paranoiac. I think that the whole world is conspiring to make me happy." Isn't that classic? That's amazing. Edgar Cayce said that Jesus laughed and told jokes on his way to the cross. It must have been a beautiful day, you think? Now, Jesus is the brother. Now, Jesus was very friendly and very happy. We don't think of Jesus as friendly so much. We think of him as giving these talks on the hillside and confronting the Pharisees and all of this. But he was just a nice guy. That's what Edgar Cayce said. He was just a nice guy. He was a guy that you like to be with. He knew you the first time you met as if he had always known you all your life, and he made a connection with you. Now, you've known people like that. People who just connect. They just find a connection. And they talk to you like they've known you for a long time. Now, I met a man who became my friend that reminded me of Jesus. He was a quadriplegic that I met in a nursing home. He was tall and black and pretty much abandoned by the world. When he had been hurt, no one had attended to his legs, and his knees were locked shut. So for 24 hours a day, the poor man was stretched out in a bed. He was 6'5", watching television. You imagine spending your whole life watching television? My God. It's like eating out of the garbage can. Now, he had gotten the nursing home staff to call a priest to give him last rites and help him commit suicide. I was the priest they called. He looked so happy to see me. He said, "Well, you're here. How are we going to do it?" I said, his name is Stanley. I said, "Stanley, if I did that, I'd go to jail. You'd go to heaven, and I'd go to jail." So I said, "I can't do that." But I said, "I can listen to you and take notes and write a book about your life. And every week we can eat fried chicken." He looked, the light showed in his eyes, and he said, "I guess that would be okay." So I started to know Stanley, and Stanley started to know me. He was one of the most courageous people I've ever known. Excuse me a minute. After a few months, we became friends, and he became my confidant. My confidant. We commiserated. I was horribly alone, too. Priests can feel very much by themselves. And neither of us could have sex, but we could both eat fried chicken and laugh. That sounds like cold comfort, doesn't it? But Stanley taught me the meaning of courage, to keep living when there was no other choice. He also showed me how to be resilient and kind to people who did not care about me. Stanley always had to do that. He had to be nice to his caregivers. If not, they wouldn't care about him. They wouldn't do what they were supposed to, and he might die. He was a little human relations machine. After a year, we got Stan's leg amputated just above the knee and bought him a motorized wheelchair. He was suddenly mobile. He could go around the city. He wanted to go see a raunchy sex movie that was playing at a theater near his nursing home. You know, neither of us were indulging at that time, so we wanted to kind of do so vicariously. So we went. Well, when the movie was over, the lights came up, and a parishioner was sitting right in front of me. And the parishioner looked at me, and he said, "What are you doing here, Father?" I had on my priest clothes and everything. And I said, "Well, what are you doing here? I could ask you the same question." He didn't know what to say. I said, "Well, I'm here because of him." I'm doing the work of the Lord. He looked at me a little skeptically and scuttled away. Stanley was a friend like Jesus, always ready to hear what I needed to say and encourage me along the thorny road to life. Well, there's a fourth face of Jesus that I didn't mention. It's Jesus the challenger. The challenger. Challenging us to be, like Lloyd said, all those sayings relate to this sermon today, to be your real self, to be who you really are and what you really are, and to treat other people like them, their real selves too. I think if Jesus came back today, he would not come to the fellowship. He would not come to churches. He would go to the southern border. He would go to Ukraine. He'd go to Gaza. He'd go to places where human dignity was being compromised. That's where he'd go. And he would look back at us and he would say, "Why don't you go with me? Why don't you attend to the poor and the suffering? Because they need help. They need a friend. They need a healer, and they need a mystic. And you, my friends, fill the bill. We have a lot of mystics in this church. They're very quiet, most of them. We have a lot of healers, like Carol Ann. And we have a lot of friends. Thank you.